Hi everyone, I'm Mr. Boyle from Waite High School. I'm bringing you a mini lesson today on America's Homefront during World War II. This covers Ohio's learning standards for American history, content statements 21 and 22, and AP US History benchmark 712. So my students will be shocked to learn I'm going to tie this little presentation back to Toledo history like I do with pretty much everything for good or ill, so let's get to it. Okay. So, I want you to sit back, close your eyes, and try and imagine how bad it was in Toledo during the depths of the Great Depression. Try to imagine your neighborhood, try to imagine downtown, empty factories, all of that stuff. Got a picture in your head? Good. Now, multiply however bad you thought that was times 4. The Great Depression hit Toledo a lot worse than a lot of other places in America. Not only did we have a huge percentage of people working for one company, that being Willis Overland, but we also were the epicenter of one of the worst bank collapses in the entire nation. So here's what that looked like for people in Toledo. Hoovervilles. Take a good long look at this. Pause if you need to. Now, if you show this to your parents, they're going to recognize those smokestacks in the background. This is the riverfront behind the old Edison plant on the east side. This is basically across, like if you drew a line straight from Waite High School to the river, this would be right behind Waite High School at the riverfront. These shacks were part of one of Toledo's Hoovervilles, these shanty towns that were created on public land, like this one on the edge of the river, where people kind of threw together whatever materials they had to make a shelter. I'm only spending time on this for one reason, and that's that a lot of times when we look at isolationism in America before World War II, we kind of look back and say, what a bunch of idiots. And I think the only reason we think that about them is because we know how the story ends. They didn't. And we have to understand how it was for them. So I want you to think about this and try to feel what they're feeling in these buildings, in this place. You're living in one of these shacks on the river. And imagine those cold winds that we get in January or February, blowing west to east, across the river, over the ice, and through these little pieces of wood and these roofs on these places. Stuff that you scavenged together to barely make a shelter, right? So let's be honest, the only thing you're focused on when you live here in this time is survival. If the government tells you in the middle of this, yeah, we're going to spend a lot of money on a great big military to go take care of a massive problem overseas, you're probably not down with that when you're living here. So no matter how big that problem was overseas by 1936, 1937, 1938, a large number of people are not going to see a reason to get involved when there's such trouble like this in this picture at home. So I kind of want to start this lesson by getting us to empathize with a group of people whom it is really easy to look back on as being part of the problem. So understanding that, we need to know that in the spring of 1940, most Americans were really, really against American involvement. This from the Holocaust Museum shows you. In May of 1940, 93% of Americans were against American involvement, even after the invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. When France falls, that changes. As you can see, it significantly changes, and we get to 61% of Americans saying we should stay out. And this is long after Americans had a real good idea of just how evil Hitler was and the atrocities being committed by the Japanese military in China. And again, most people who were opposed to the war were kind of passively opposed to it. They weren't sympathizing with the enemy. But it's really important to note that some people were. So throughout the 1930s, there were a number of pro-Nazi organizations in America, including the German-American Bund. And this is crazy, but the picture you're looking at here is a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in New York, where like the Knicks and the Rangers played. And you see American flags, George Washington, and if you look carefully at that banner on the far left, you see swastikas. They were trying to make an American Nazi party on American soil. There were also German language newspapers, including one in Toledo, that were reprinting propaganda sent straight from Nazi Germany. There was a priest on the radio, Father Charles Coughlin, who had a huge listening audience, who had also kind of rechurned out Nazi propaganda. And one of the strongest voices against Coughlin was actually a pastor from Toledo, a guy named Walton Cole, who eviscerated Coughlin on the radio and in print publications and interviews. So all of this is to help you understand a little bit. President Roosevelt was under a ton of pressure to take it slow with intervening in the Second World War. The American people were not there yet. So it starts with the cash and carry policy, which allowed non-military goods to be purchased by the combatant nations, but they had to pay for them up front and move them on their own vessels because we didn't want American ships getting sunk by German subs and triggering war. Then it's destroyers for bases. This is in 1940, and we make this deal where we traded Great Britain a whole bunch of old destroyers from World War I in return for the rights to about a half dozen British bases in the Caribbean and Canada, which ended up being critically important to us when the war breaks out. Then you get the Lend-Lease Act, which said the U.S. could lend but not sell, necessarily, war material to countries we believed were important to our national defense. A couple weeks ago, I talked to a gentleman who grew up in Birmingham during the war. He was 10 years old when Lend-Lease was signed, and he remembered his dad being really worried when that news came out, saying it was going to lead us into war. So, what's all this got to do with Toledo? Plenty. In gradually ramping up support for the European allies, Roosevelt is creating demand for manufactured goods, especially vehicles, vehicle parts, weapons from U.S. factories. And that's what got Toledo back to work again. And there was nobody more important in this effort than this guy that you see walking out of the White House here. His name was John David Biggers. And prior to the war, Biggers was the president of the Libby Owens Ford Glass Company, one of the companies that really made Toledo the glass city. In 1940, FDR names Biggers to the National Defense Advisory Council. And a few months later, he puts him in charge of production for the Office of Production Management. And there's probably nobody in Toledo history who did more for the city than John D. Biggers, a guy whose name you have probably never heard before today. Because Biggers convinces the city leaders to do a full inventory of every factory in the city, no matter how small. And he's asking them to ask questions like, what tools do we have? How much space? How many tool and die makers? How many metal workers? How many welders, etc. And the city does it. They create this inventory. And when the federal government comes around by 1941 saying, hey, we need somebody to make shell casings, Toledo businesses could say, yeah, we got the right tools, the right workers, and we can take that contract right now. Whereas maybe a city like, I'm just picking these out of the sky, but like Milwaukee or Gary, Indiana, may not have been able to do that because they didn't kind of have this inside track. I would argue that you could say Biggers literally put thousands of Toledoans back to work through his foresight and his connections, and he wasn't done. Chapter 2 on this. We all recognize this right away, but you might notice it looks a little different than what we think of. The first designs for a Jeep came from a small company called American Bantam that was out of Pennsylvania. They were a very small car maker. They came up with this initial scout vehicle prototype. And Ford from up in Detroit and Willis Overland from here both got to have access to the blueprints and try and make better versions. So Willis Overland popped a new engine they had called the Go Devil into this thing and made a few other modifications. Ford came in and said, look, we can make more of these than anybody else. We're the Ford Motor Company. This is what we do. And that's when John David Biggers steps in again. And Biggers says to the federal government, look, Ford's a massive company. They can do lots of things like build bombers and build great big trucks and stuff. Willis can't do that, but Willis can do this. And Biggers almost single-handedly makes sure that Willis Overland gets to make vast numbers of Jeeps in this war, which is going to put thousands of Toledoans back to work. So, at first in the war, it's about putting people back to work, mostly men. And then in the late summer of 40, Roosevelt institutes the first peacetime draft in American history. It is hugely unpopular. We're not at war yet. And in America at that point, which may sound nuts to us today, we had never had a big army during peacetime. We'd always waited for a war. So we go to war, we build the army up after we get in, and then as soon as the war's over, we send all the soldiers home. Having a peacetime army sounded nuts to people in 1940. FDR does it anyways. Here in Toledo, some of the first to go are guys from the 148th Infantry Regiment, which was an Ohio National Guard formation that is still located here to this day. As all of these guys go off for training, somebody's got to take these more and more jobs that are opening up in the factories. And so even before the war starts, Toledo women and the city's growing African-American community are getting into factories that never would have been open to them years earlier. And all of this is happening as America thinks it's heading right towards war with Germany. And then the attack at Pearl Harbor happens. As it turns out, there were at least 24 guys from Toledo at Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. I'm going to share just one of the stories of a guy named Dean Orwick. This is Orwick's senior picture from Waite High School, where he was part of the radio club. A bunch of students who worked with like ham radios and stuff and built transmitters and antennas. Dean Orwick joins the Navy in 1939, and he becomes a radio operator in the Navy, kind of using those skills that he got at Waite High School to become a member of the Navy. And over the 2 years leading up to Pearl Harbor, Orwick moves up in the ranks. He gets assigned to the USS Nevada, which is a battleship. And in the second wave of the Japanese attack, his ship actually manages to get underway. And they're trying to flee the harbor. And then all of a sudden, Japanese bombers target them. The guys in the radio room with Dean Orwick, they hear the bombs. One of them pierces right through the radio room. And the other guys look over, and Dean Orwick says, and this is a direct quote, "My foot's gone, isn't it?" And the other guys who are surviving, they take him to a hospital ship nearby, and he ends up dying later from shock. Orwick ends up being the first casualty from Toledo reported home in the Blade. He's the first of the more than 1,100 Toledoans who are going to die in this war in service of their country. Interesting story real quick. Orwick's name is on at least 3 monuments in the city of Toledo. The main one downtown behind the police headquarters has the names of everybody from Toledo who died. A big granite one in Waite High School's Memorial Garden. And then the one I think is the most special is this one, the honor roll inside Oakdale Elementary. To the best of my knowledge, Oakdale is the only school that still has their original honor roll. And if you see all those names that are typed on there, every time a guy who went to Oakdale joined the military, they put his name on this honor roll. And like I said, as far as I know, Oakdale is the only place in town that did that. So Pearl Harbor really wakes Americans up. It's an incredibly traumatic day for the nation. And if we'd sort of been getting ready in 40 and early 41, after Pearl Harbor, every American realizes they have a part in the war. Whether it's fighting in the armed services or working in the factories or being good citizens and conserving resources. And I kind of want to talk about that last part first because it's kind of where we're at today with the COVID-19 crisis, right? We're being asked to do stuff for the good of the nation right now, like staying inside and washing our hands and staying away from people. Let's talk about back then first. The government had to ration food to make sure people wouldn't just buy everything and hoard it when we needed to feed the troops overseas. And let's be honest, after the past few weeks of toilet paper being kind of non-existent, I think maybe we can finally understand why they did rationing in World War II. To supplement the limited food you were allowed to buy at the grocery stores, people were encouraged to grow victory gardens. I love this comic book cover. And if there's ever been a comic book I want to read, it's the comic book about Superman farming. Look how Superman uses his superpowers to lift bushel baskets of vegetables. And then, by the way, the other thing that cracks me up, check out Robin in the back here. Like, get with the program, dude. Stop taking your little break. Get back to work with the victory garden. You're a superhero. Come on, man. Okay, so victory gardens in Toledo. Most of these are in people's backyards. But all over Toledo, these gardens sprouted up in people's yards and neighborhoods so people could grow their own extra food. But 2 of the coolest victory gardens in town were massive. One was exactly where the new DeVoe School is today. The old school that I have a picture of here, the old school was out front. And the footprint of the current DeVoe School was a massive 17-acre victory garden for the neighborhood. And everybody in the neighborhood was allowed to go in there and, you know, plant maybe a 10-foot by 20-foot garden of their own within this massive garden. The other victory garden in town that was really cool, and I wish I had pictures of it, was up between Jackman and Tremainsville. And it was probably the biggest in town. It was 88 acres, which is like 70 football fields worth of growing space. And that plot was owned by Willis Overland. The company took that land up there and told all of the people, the thousands of Toledans who work there, you can grow a small plot in this space. So Toledo people really did a bang-up job of making sure they were helping to supplement the food and everything. By far the biggest change that happened because of the war was the expanded role of women and African-American people in almost every facet of society. Women were at work in almost every one of Toledo's factories. There are some cool stories about women who welded at Toledo Shipbuilding. This one that I got a picture of right here. The lady in the small picture in the inset, her husband and her son were both in the Navy, and here she is welding ships in Toledo that they could possibly be using someday. Not everybody thought it was great. There was a letter to the editor of the Blade in 1943 with this lady who was big mad about her husband working with women, and she suggested we needed a city law to make sure men worked on one shift and women worked on the other shift because men can't control themselves. Apart from complaints like that, for a lot of women, it was a liberating experience. You also had hundreds of Toledo women joining the armed services and working in a number of really amazing roles. Kind of a little known fact, 2 Toledo women, Lois Wetmore, who I've got a picture of here, and another woman named Lenore Moon, died in service of the country. And as far as we know, they're the only 2 women from Toledo who died in the service during the Second World War. There is also no way to overstate how important the war was for our African-American community. Thousands of black people had moved from the rural South to cities like Toledo to fill jobs during the war, and they made our city a better place, even when our city didn't make that easy. Public housing before the war was almost exclusively for white people. And a lot of white Toledoans got really upset when they thought black people would move into the same neighborhoods as them. Up in the north, kind of near Chase School, the city was trying to build a separate housing complex for black people. And whites in the neighborhood lost their minds about it, and it was a really big fight throughout all of 1944. And it kind of shows that racism was not just a Southern problem. Racism was absolutely a problem in the North in this late Jim Crow era. Now, African-American men and women served with incredible valor during the war. And probably the most notable from Toledo is the guy at the center here, Jake Chandler. He was a standout track star at Scott High School and led the school to its only state title in track in the school's history. He went to UT, and I can't explain to you guys enough. That was a pretty big deal because even colleges in the North didn't allow a lot of black students. Chandler goes to college to become a teacher, which is probably why I find him so interesting. But after graduation, he doesn't become a teacher. He ends up working for the Toledo Police Department. And while he wasn't the first black policeman in Toledo, he was among a vanguard in that department, and the department had very little diversity at that time. As a cop, he could have stayed in Toledo, but he enlisted and ended up becoming one of embarrassingly few black officers in the American infantry units. So Second Lieutenant Chandler becomes a platoon commander in the 92nd Infantry Division, leads his men in a heroic stand in the mountains of Italy in the winter of '45, and he's killed in action. After his death, he's awarded the Silver Star, which, in my amateur opinion, probably should have been upgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. One other thing I want to talk to you about regarding Toledo's African-American community and what I think is one of the most heroic deeds they pulled off in the war. And it ties in to one of the things you need to know about World War II and the Homefront. You all know by now that the U.S. government rounded up Japanese Americans on the West Coast, shipped them off to prison camps in the interior of the country. What you might not have known is that some Toledoans were also picked up in those months after Pearl Harbor. 5 Japanese Americans in Toledo were arrested by the FBI 2 days after Pearl Harbor, and then they disappeared. I've never been able to find out what happened to these folks. But then this story takes kind of a twist. By late '43, the government started to realize there were people they could move out of those camps in the interior to cities across the country because they were truly no danger to anybody. They were completely patriotic Americans. So they started sending Japanese Americans from the camps to cities. Toledo was scheduled to get about 100 Japanese American relocation folks from these camps. And bunch of white people in Toledo got really, really mad, and they managed to get a city councilman on their side. And they tried to get a resolution by the city council banning Japanese Americans from coming to town, which I think to us today is almost impossible to believe. It's gross. But they have this council meeting, and a few people stood up to defend them. And one of them was Roy C. Start, former mayor of Toledo, who I think has a building named after him in town. But the most passionate voice, and this is where I'm bringing it all together, is Reverend Calvin Sterker, who was the pastor at Third Baptist Church. And at this council meeting in April of '43, the Reverend stands up before the city council and just puts the council and the complainers completely on blast. And the Blade reported that he said, quote, "Even though the Negroes would suffer most in competition for jobs, living quarters, and standard of living with the Japanese here, he was in favor of the plan." And then there's this devastating direct quote from him. And Reverend Sterker says, "We know very well the problems of a minority people and believe the American-born Japanese should be accorded the same treatment as other Americans of enemy nationality." His words work, and the vote ends up 7-1. The resolution gets defeated. Only the guy who sponsored it voted for it. So, I know I've gone over my allotted time here, but I want to quickly review a couple of key points with you. Number one, a lot of people were opposed to the U.S. getting involved in the good war. A lot of people were opposed to the U.S. getting in the war, some of them for good reasons, some of them for absolutely evil ones. Second point, the U.S. took a lot of baby steps towards war when we helped the European allies, and those baby steps all kind of created this environment that led to jobs for a lot of people throughout the country. After Pearl Harbor, though, very few people opposed the war, and most citizens tried to do everything they could to support the war effort. The war, fourth point, was a transformational moment for women and African American people, and it opened up all kinds of new roles for them in society and really laid the foundation for the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements that are going to come out in the 50s and 60s. Finally, Japanese Americans from the West Coast were subjected to unjust imprisonment. Japanese Americans throughout the country, including in Toledo, were subjected to quite a bit of racism. So, thank you for hanging in there with me. Please do your part in the war that we're in right now. Maintain that 6-foot distance from people. Wash your hands a bunch. Don't do risky things that would take a hospital bed away from somebody who needs it worse than we do. We are in a war again, and we all have a lot of power in deciding how that turns out. Thanks for listening to me. Take care.